The wind had a way of speaking out on the plains, a lonely whistle that slipped through cracks in the wooden shutters and rattled along the empty porch rails. It was a sound Jedediah Cole had grown used to, almost come to rely on. To him it wasn't just the wind, it was a reminder that life was still out there, moving, shifting, even if his world had gone still long ago. The ranch stretched wide and endless, rolling hills that faded into shadow at dusk, and golden grass that glowed under the sun. From a distance it looked alive, but up close it carried the tired look of something worn thin. Fences leaned, patched in places where storms had torn them down. The barn's roof sagged. The cattle roamed fewer each year, dwindling with the seasons. Jed never complained, though. Complaints had no ears to fall on, and talking to himself too often made him feel like a man who'd lost his grip. His wife, Martha, had been the last soul to walk beside him. Her laughter had once filled the ranch house, brightening corners even sunlight couldn't reach. She planted wildflowers by the creek and insisted that they mark their love with roots that would outlast them. Jed had tried after her death to tend those flowers the way she had, but his hands were built for leather and rope, not delicate petals. Eventually the flowers grew wild, spreading unevenly, yet each spring they returned, stubborn as the memory of her. Her grave lay under the oak tree by that same creek, a place where the earth was always soft, always damp. Jed visited often, hat in hand, speaking words that broke apart in the wind before they could settle. The townsfolk, 20 miles east, had long given up on him. They knew of the tragedy and left him to his solitude. Once in a while, when supplies ran low, Jed hitched his old horse, traveled the dusty trail into town, and traded for flour, salt, or ammunition. Faces followed him, curious, pitying, or wary. He had no interest in their chatter. To them he was the hermit rancher, a man half-ghost already, married to silence and land. It suited him just fine. Winter had a way of clawing harder on the plains, dragging itself into bones and boards alike. That year, the cold was sharper than he remembered. Snow began to fall early, covering the ground in a heavy quilt that muted sound and softened the horizon. Jed chopped wood until his hands blistered, stacked it near the door, and rationed the smoked beef he had left. He kept to his routine with the same stubbornness that had kept him alive all these years. Rise with the dawn, tend the cattle, check the fences, eat when hunger bit, and sleep when the sky told him to. But nights were hardest. The house creaked in protest as if it too felt the cold. The fire he built fought against the draft but never conquered it, leaving the air heavy with chill. Jed sat close to the flames, pipe in hand, the glow of embers reflecting in his eyes. Sometimes he would catch himself speaking out loud, half to Martha, half to the emptiness, and then stop, ashamed of his own loneliness. It was on one such night, as the wind screamed and the snow hammered the windows, that Jed first saw the figures. At first he thought the storm was playing tricks on him. Through the blur of falling snow, shadows moved near the gate, a dozen dark shapes blending with the night. His hand instinctively reached for the rifle resting against the wall, fingers curling around the worn stock. His breath froze as the shapes came closer, 10 of them, men and women huddled together against the storm, some leading children half hidden beneath blankets. The moonlight cut through the clouds for just a moment, enough for Jed to see their faces, and his heart thudded with recognition. Apaches. Every story he had ever heard about them came rushing back like a flood. Raids on settlements, ambushes on lonely trails, bloody feuds that scarred the land long before he laid claim to it. His father had warned him of them, his neighbors whispered about them, and the scars on the land told the rest. For an instant he thought of bolting the door, crouching behind the fire with his rifle, waiting for them to pass. But then he caught sight of one detail he couldn't shake. The leader, tall and broad-shouldered, stood at the front. His face was stern, his eyes sharp and unwavering, but his shoulders sagged in a way Jed recognized well. It was the posture of a man exhausted, worn by miles, carrying burdens heavy enough to drag even the strongest spirit low. Beside him, a woman clutched a child to her chest, shielding the little one from the biting wind. Another boy, no more than 10, stumbled in the snow, his tiny hands gripping a pony's mane for balance. Jed's throat tightened. These weren't raiders. They weren't here to fight. They were simply trying to survive. The leader raised a hand, not in threat but in quiet greeting. His voice carried over the wind, calm yet firm. "We seek shelter." Jed froze. His first instinct screamed caution. Letting them in meant opening his home, breaking the wall of solitude he had built brick by brick over the years. It meant taking a risk that could cost him everything. The rifle in his hand felt heavier now, as though it carried not just bullets but the weight of decision. And yet, in that moment, Jed thought of Martha. He remembered her words when they first settled on this land. Hospitality is a law older than fences. Jed, out here neighbors aren't chosen, they're given. He had brushed off her kindness then, always the practical man, but now, her voice returned like an echo from the grave, pushing against the hard shell he had built around himself. Snow lashed harder, clinging to their shoulders, their hair, their blankets. The children shivered violently. The leader's gaze never wavered, though Jed could see the tightness in his jaw, the silent plea behind his eyes. Jed inhaled deeply, the air cold enough to sting. Slowly, with a heaviness that felt like betrayal to his own fear, he set the rifle back against the wall. His boots scraped the floorboards as he stepped toward the door. When he pulled it open, the storm rushed in, swirling flakes across the floor and into the firelight. He stood aside, voice rough with disuse. "Get in, then." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the leader gave a short nod, guiding the others forward. They entered cautiously, eyes darting around the small, dimly lit room as if expecting a trap. The fire crackled louder, throwing orange light across their tired faces. Children pressed close to the warmth, sighs escaping their lips like small ghosts. Women loosened blankets to reveal faces flushed from cold. The house, once a cavern of silence, suddenly swelled with life. Breath, footsteps, the rustle of cloth. It was as though walls long dormant woke up, stretching against the weight of sound. Jed stood near the door, hat still in his hands, unsure of what he had just done. The Apaches clustered near the hearth, their presence both foreign and strangely fitting, as though the house had been waiting for them all along. For the first time in years, Jed felt the silence break, not shattered but lifted, as if a burden had been carried away on the backs of strangers. He didn't know what the coming days would bring or if his decision would prove wise. But one thing was certain, the ranch would never again be as empty as it had been. And though he would never admit it aloud, deep inside, a forgotten ember flickered to life. Jed Cole didn't sleep that first night after letting the Apaches into his home. He sat in his old rocker by the window, rifle propped against the wall within reach, eyes half on the storm outside and half on the people gathered near his fire. He couldn't quite convince himself that he hadn't made a mistake. Years of living alone had hardened him, carved suspicion deep into his bones. He knew what townsfolk would say if they could see his ranch house now. Jed Cole had finally gone mad, taken Indians into his home, invited danger where none had been before. But then he looked at the children, curled together like pups on blankets near the hearth, their chests rising and falling with the slow rhythm of sleep, and something in him softened despite the voice in his head that told him he was a fool. The leader sat apart from the rest, cross-legged on the floor with his back straight, eyes never closing though his body betrayed its weariness. The firelight painted shadows across his face, deepening the lines of hardship and endurance. Jed admired the man's discipline even as it unsettled him. There was a quiet authority about him that needed no words. Every so often Jed would catch the man's gaze, steady, unreadable, almost challenging. But not once did he see hostility. When dawn came, the storm had passed. The snow lay heavy over the land, glistening under the pale morning sun. Jed rose, joints stiff, and moved to stoke the fire. The children stirred, rubbing their eyes, peering at him as though trying to decide if he was friend or foe. Their mothers whispered soft words in Apache tongue, coaxing them to rise. The men, few though they were, prepared themselves with a soldier's swiftness, pulling on moccasins, adjusting belts, checking the few weapons they carried. The leader finally approached Jed. He didn't speak English easily, but his words were careful, chosen. "You gave us fire," he said. "For that we thank you." His voice was deep, quiet, carrying weight that made it feel larger than the room. Jed gave a short nod. "Storm would have killed you all. No sense in leaving folks to freeze." The man studied him for a long moment as if measuring not just his words but the man behind them. Then he placed his hand briefly over his chest, a gesture of respect. "My name is Nantan. We travel far. Soldiers took our land. We go north." Jed chewed the inside of his cheek. He had heard of such things. Tribes pushed off their ground, forced to wander like ghosts on the land their fathers had walked free upon. Still, it wasn't his fight. He had enough troubles keeping his cattle alive and his fences standing. Yet looking at them now, their exhaustion plain, he couldn't bring himself to turn them away. "You'll need food," Jed said gruffly, surprising even himself. "Can't make it far on empty bellies." He motioned for them to follow him into the small kitchen. From a cupboard, he pulled down cornmeal, dried beans, and strips of smoked beef. The Apaches watched him closely, their expressions unreadable, but when he set the food down, their restraint broke. Women began preparing a meal with practiced efficiency, moving as though they had done this in 100 different places before. Children perked up at the smell of food cooking, laughter spilling into the air, a sound Jed realized he hadn't heard in his house since Martha had passed. By midday, the ranch that had long been silent now buzzed with life. Jed led 2 of the Apache men out to the barn. They followed without hesitation, helping him haul water for the cattle and pitch hay. Their movements were skilled, their strength obvious. At first, Jed stayed cautious, watching for any sign that they might be casing his property for mischief. But the longer they worked, the more it became clear they had no interest in theft or harm. They were simply people trying to carry the weight of survival. Later, when the sun began its slow fall westward, Jed found himself sitting by the corral with Nantan. They spoke little at first, sharing the silence the way 2 men might share a bottle. Jed whittled a small piece of wood, his hand steady from years of habit. Nantan watched the horses in the corral, his eyes sharp but softened in the presence of the animals. "You live here alone?" Nantan finally asked, his English thick but understandable. Jed hesitated, then nodded. "A long time now. Your woman?" "Gone." Jed's jaw tightened. He didn't answer right away, but the weight in his silence was answer enough. Nantan gave a slow nod as if he understood more than Jed could say. "My people, many gone," Nantan said after a while. "Soldiers take, hunger take, cold take, still, we walk." Jed looked at him, really looked, and saw the shadow of grief carved deep into the man's features. It was a grief different from his own, but cut from the same cloth. They were men carrying ghosts, each in their own way. In that quiet recognition, something shifted. Jed no longer saw Nantan as an outsider or a threat, but as another man who had been forced to keep going when the world took too much. That night, they shared a meal together. Jed sat at the head of his rough-hewn table, a place that had sat empty far too long, while the Apaches filled the benches and floor around him. The fire burned bright, casting a golden glow over the scene. Stories were told in Apache tongue, voices rising and falling like song. Jed couldn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. The laughter of the children, the gentle teasing among the men, the warmth of the women's voices, all of it filled the emptiness of the house in a way he had thought impossible. For the first time in years, Jed smiled without realizing it. Days passed. The Apaches remained, too weary to continue north just yet. Each morning, they worked beside Jed as if the ranch were theirs too. Fences that had long sagged were repaired with swift, skillful hands. Horses that had grown restless under Jed's solitary care responded calmly to the touch of the Apache children. They carried water, chopped wood, and gathered kindling with an efficiency born of necessity. In the evenings they gathered by the fire. Nantan told stories of his people's past, words translated haltingly into English for Jed's sake. He spoke of battles fought, of lands lost, of spirits that still walked beside them. Jed, in turn, shared small pieces of his own past, the building of the ranch, the days when cattle filled the pastures, the quiet strength of Martha and how she had kept his heart tethered to hope. It was strange how quickly routine returned. Jed had lived in silence for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to share the burden of living, to rise knowing there were others who would face the day with him. The loneliness he had worn like a second skin began to loosen, peeling away with each passing hour. But word traveled fast in the west, even across snow-choked plains. On his next trip into town, Jed noticed the stares more pointed, the whispers louder. A storekeeper leaned across the counter, voice low. "Heard tell you've got company out your way, Cole. Red company." His eyes narrowed, suspicion sharp as a blade. "That true?" Jed kept his face blank. "Storm came through. I didn't see fit to let folks freeze. That's all." The man grunted, unconvinced. By the time Jed mounted his horse to ride home, he could feel the weight of eyes on his back, heavier than the supplies in his saddlebags. He knew then that trouble wasn't far behind. When he returned, the children rushed to greet him, their small hands tugging at the reins, their laughter bubbling up into the frosty air. For a moment, all thoughts of town and trouble fell away. The house, the barn, the very land itself felt alive again, pulsing with the rhythm of voices and footsteps that had been missing for far too long. But as Jed looked out over the horizon, his instincts whispered what his heart refused to admit: this peace wouldn't last. Men with suspicion in their hearts and rifles in their hands would come. The question was no longer if but when, and for the first time in years Jed realized he wasn't afraid to stand his ground. Not alone. Not anymore. Snow melted slowly on the plains, revealing the brown, tired earth beneath. Spring came like a whisper, tentative and uncertain, but enough to rouse the land from its frozen slumber. On Jed Cole's ranch, the change was felt not just in the soil, but in the rhythm of life. Where once only silence had reigned, now there was sound and motion. Children laughing in the fields, the ring of hammers on wood as fences were mended, the deep voices of men working shoulder to shoulder. Jed had never thought he'd see the ranch alive again. For years it had been nothing more than a shell, its walls echoing with ghosts and empty space. Now each corner seemed filled with purpose. The Apaches moved through the place with an ease that surprised him, as though the land itself welcomed them. They didn't treat the ranch as strangers, rather they adapted to it, folding themselves into its routines, respecting it as though it were a living thing. Every morning Jed rose with the dawn and found the fire already burning, water already hauled, and sometimes even breakfast waiting. Nantan's people carried a discipline that rivaled any army Jed had known in his youth. It wasn't the order of command, but of survival, an instinctive knowledge that everyone must contribute if they were all to endure. Jed came to respect it deeply. He also began to learn from them. One of the younger men, Taza, showed him how to twist sinew into strong cord, better than the store-bought twine Jed used to bind tools. A woman named Desoda Hai taught him to grind dried berries with animal fat, to make a paste that lasted longer than his salted jerky. Even the children surprised him. They could read the land better than Jed, spotting rabbit tracks, finding hidden caches of kindling beneath snowdrifts, or coaxing the horses into calm with gentle whispers. In turn, Jed offered what he knew. He showed them how to mend iron with his old blacksmith tools, how to stretch a cowhide until it was supple, how to smoke beef in his weathered smokehouse so it wouldn't spoil. Slowly, a quiet exchange formed, each giving and taking without keeping score. At night, they sat by the fire, their voices carrying into the rafters. The Apaches told stories of their ancestors, of spirits that watched over rivers and mountains, of warriors who had walked before them. Jed couldn't understand all the words, but Nantan would translate enough for him to follow. One story told of a hawk who lost his mate and flew alone for many seasons, believing he had no place in the sky anymore. Then one winter he found a flock of crows struggling in the snow. The hawk taught them how to hunt, and in return the crows taught him how to laugh again. Jed said nothing, but as he listened he felt Martha's memory stir in his chest, and his hand drifted unconsciously toward the oak tree beyond the creek. Yet beneath the warmth of this newfound bond, a shadow grew. Jed knew it, felt it, even if he didn't want to voice it. Trouble was circling, drawing nearer with every day the Apaches remained on his land. It started with small signs. On one trip into town, Jed caught the blacksmith watching him too long, his hammer still in his hand but idle. A group of ranchers stood outside the saloon, their voices dropping when Jed passed, their stares sharp and suspicious. He ignored them, bought what he needed, and rode back, but his gut twisted the whole way home. Later, he overheard two riders on the trail ahead of him. They didn't see him at first, and their words carried in the open air. "Cole's gone soft. Heard he's feeding him, letting him sleep under his roof like family. Damn fool. Won't be long before they cut his throat and take the place. You'll see. Once Apache, always Apache." Jed kept his horse back, silent, until they rode out of earshot, but the words stayed with him heavy as lead. When he returned that evening, Nantan noticed the storm in his eyes. The Apache leader sat across from him at the table, his gaze sharp but calm. "The town," he said simply. Jed nodded. "They're talking. They will come." Nantan's tone wasn't fearful. It was matter-of-fact, as though he had already prepared for it. Jed leaned back, exhaling hard. "If they come, it'll be with rifles. Men here don't forgive easy. They still see you as the enemy, no matter what's true." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Nantan said, "You could send us away." "Easier for you." Jed's eyes hardened. I buried my wife under that oak tree yonder. This ranch is all I got left of her. You think I'd turn it into a place that spits people out into the cold? No, you're here now. That means something. Nantan studied him, then gave a single nod of respect. It was enough. The days stretched on, each one edged with tension. Though the Apaches worked hard, though laughter still warmed the evenings, Jed couldn't shake the sense of a clock ticking down. He noticed the men taking turns keeping watch at night, their figures dark against the moonlit horizon. He didn't ask them to, but they did it anyway, as though they too knew the storm was building. One afternoon, while repairing a section of fence with Taza, Jed saw dust rising on the eastern trail. Riders. He shaded his eyes and counted at least 5, maybe 6. They didn't come close, just lingered far off, their silhouettes watching. Jed felt the prickle of eyes on his back long after they turned away. That evening, he told Nantan what he'd seen. The Apache leader's jaw tightened.
They wait.
They count. Then they will return with more. Jed rubbed his temples. They think you're a threat. Doesn't matter what I say. To them, you're the enemy. And you? Nantan asked quietly. Jed looked around the room, the women cooking near the fire, the children playing with sticks, the young men mending leather. Then his gaze returned to Nantan. I see people, folks trying to survive same as me. That's all. Something unspoken passed between them then, a bond forged in honesty. As the days warmed into early summer, Jed realized he had changed. The man who once woke to silence now woke to voices, to purpose. He had begun to laugh again, to share not just his work but his burdens. The loneliness that had wrapped around him like a shroud was loosening, falling away. Yet he knew this piece hung by a thread, fragile as a spider's web in the wind. One evening, Nantan approached him while the others sat by the fire. He crouched low, his voice steady but serious. When they come, we will fight. My people do not run. Jed's jaw clenched. He had fought enough in his youth, knew the weight of blood on soil. If it comes to it, you'll not stand alone. This is my land. If men want to cross that fence, they'll have to put me in the ground first. Nantan's eyes met his, and for the first time, Jed saw something there beyond respect, something like kinship. The rancher who had once been alone now stood with 10 souls beside him. And as whispers in town grew into plans and riders gathered more boldly at the edges of his land, Jed knew the test was coming. It was no longer just about survival. It was about belonging, about the right to stand one's ground and call a place home. And for the first time in years, Jed didn't dread the fight ahead. Because this time he had something worth defending. The summer dusk painted the sky in streaks of crimson and gold, bleeding into deep purple at the edges. Jed Cole stood by the gate of his ranch, staring out at the horizon where dust rose in the distance. He knew what that dust meant. Riders. More than a handful this time. His heart thudded slow and steady like a hammer striking iron. He'd been waiting for this. The day had finally come. Behind him, the ranch house glowed warm with firelight. Children's laughter, subdued but still present, carried faintly into the air. The Apaches were gathered, watchful, their eyes sharp, their bodies tense with the anticipation of what was coming. Nantan stood closest, his broad frame unmoving, his gaze locked on the same horizon as Jed's. They come? Nantan said quietly, his voice steady as a mountain. Jed nodded. Yeah, and they're not here for talk. The riders grew clearer as the distance shrank. A dozen at least, maybe more. Their rifles glinted in the dying light, their horses restless beneath them. Dust clung to their coats, to their faces hardened by suspicion and fear. Jed recognized some of them, men he'd traded with in town, men who once nodded to him over whiskey or grain. Now their eyes burned with mistrust, with the kind of righteousness that made men dangerous. One rider pushed to the front, a man named McGraw, a rancher whose spread lay just east of Jed's land. He was broad-shouldered, his face carved in lines of bitterness. He raised a hand, signaling his men to hold. Then his voice carried across the still air, loud enough for all to hear. Cole, you gone and lost your mind? Heard tell you've got Injuns holed up in your house. Feeding 'em. Harboring 'em like they're your kin. Jed didn't flinch. His voice came back clear, rough as gravel, but steady. They're not your concern, McGraw. They came to me in a storm, near froze to death. I gave 'em shelter. That's all. McGraw spat into the dirt. That ain't all. You think we don't know what they are? They'll slit your throat soon as your back's turned. And if they don't, they'll draw more. You want that war brought to all of us? He gestured sharply toward the house. Send 'em out now, Cole, send 'em out, and maybe we let this go. Otherwise, his hand drifted to his rifle. The threat hung heavy in the twilight. Jed stepped forward, his boots crunching the dry earth. His hand rested on the gate, the weathered wood cool beneath his palm. He met McGraw's gaze without wavering. This ranch is mine. My land, my rules. These people are under my roof, and I'll not send them out to be butchered because of fear and hate. You want them? You'll have to come through me first. A murmur rippled through the riders. Some shifted uneasily, their grips tightening on their rifles. They had expected resistance, but not this calm, unyielding defiance. McGraw sneered. So that's it then? You're siding with them over your own kind? Jed's jaw tightened. I buried my wife under that oak tree by the creek. I swore this land would be her legacy, not a place where I turned my back on decency. You call yourselves men, yet you drive women and children into the cold. That ain't the kind of man I'll ever be. The words hit harder than he expected. Some riders looked away, shame flickering across their faces, but others hardened further, pride refusing to bend. Behind Jed, Nantan and his people had moved closer. They stood tall, unflinching, their presence a silent wall of strength. The children stayed near the house, but their eyes glowed with trust in the men who stood between them and danger. The standoff stretched, tension coiled tight as a drawn bowstring. The cicadas in the grass buzzed loudly, the only sound in the charged silence. Jed's heart pounded, but his face showed no fear. For the first time in years, he felt utterly alive. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was standing for something. McGraw shifted in his saddle, eyes narrowing. Last chance, Cole, move aside. Jed's voice thundered back, stronger than it had in years. Not a damn inch. You'll cross this gate only if you're ready to bury me first. The words rang out across the plains, final and unshakable. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then one of the riders cursed under his breath, muttering, Ain't worth it, McGraw. You see his eyes? He means it. Another man, older, spat into the dirt but lowered his rifle. Ain't no sense in killing Cole. He's stubborn as stone, and if we shoot him, they'll all come sniffing around. McGraw's face twisted with frustration. He glared at Jed, his jaw working furiously, but the weight of hesitation in his men's eyes was plain. They weren't eager for a bloodbath, not against a man they'd known for years, not with children watching from the shadows of the ranch house. Finally, McGraw jerked his reins, wheeling his horse around. This ain't over, Cole. You'll regret the day you chose them over us. With a sharp kick, he spurred his horse forward, the others following reluctantly, their figures swallowed by dust and fading light. Jed stood unmoving until the last rider disappeared into the horizon. Only then did he exhale, his breath shaking, the weight of what almost happened pressing down on him. Behind him, Nantan stepped forward. His hand touched Jed's shoulder, firm and steady. You stood with us. You did not have to. Jed turned, meeting his gaze. I couldn't do any less. Not anymore. The firelight spilled from the ranch house, warm against the gathering night. Children ran out, their voices lifting, relieved laughter spilling into the cool air. Women followed, their faces soft with gratitude. The ranch, which had once been a hollow shell, now pulsed with life, with kinship stronger than blood. Jed looked up at the stars emerging one by one, the vast sky stretching endless above. For years he had thought himself alone beneath it, a ghost tethered to land that had lost its meaning. But now, standing shoulder to shoulder with people who had once been strangers, he felt something stir in him that he thought long dead. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. His ranch was no longer just his, it was theirs, bound not by law or blood but by choice. By the courage to share fire in the storm, to stand together when the world wanted to tear them apart. That night, as the fire crackled and voices rose in song and story, Jed sat among them, his heart lighter than it had been in decades. He glanced once toward the oak tree by the creek, where Martha's grave lay quiet beneath the stars. For the first time since she was gone, he felt at peace, as though she too was smiling on what the ranch had become. The wind swept across the plains, but it no longer sounded lonely. It carried voices now, laughter, song, the sound of family. And Jed knew with a certainty as steady as the ground beneath his boots that his ranch had finally become a home again.